there's also this, alongside the medical dimension of the fact that they're kind of physiologically and psychologically safe if administered the right way, and they can be used for healing. There's also this kind of religious or spiritual dimension, right? Because they've been
Yeah.
for a long time in places like the Native American Church using peyote, they use the sacraments, and people, even with LSD, people found produces these kind of spiritual experiences.
Hmm.
And you'd think there would be a kind of a freedom of religion, quite a straightforward freedom of religion case to make great for this in the US. At the time, was there anyone arguing for that when the initial prohibition came along?
Uh, there was one notable example. Yes, I really got to give credit to Reverend Itkin. Trying to remember. Reverend Michael Francis Itkin, yes. On May 26th of 1966, he delivered a testimony to Congress. I was blown away when I first read this in the congressional record because I didn't see this coming. Um, he was a bishop of the Metropolitan Diocese of Philadelphia, New York, as well as an abbot in the Brotherhood of the Love of Christ. Um, Donning the proverbial armor of God, the courageous Reverend plainly admitted in his congressional testimony that fellow clergy had took part within, quote, study groups attached to our parishes, which had utilized various entheogens as, quote, an adjunct to the sacramental life and the life of prayer and meditation. He had considered the prohibition of entheogens to be a, quote, intolerable abuse of our constitutional rights, end quote, because of the fact that these substances have served as a, quote, adjunct to the sacramental life and to the methods of prayer and meditation for many indigenous Christians and those who were, quote, independent seekers after the truth and grace of God. Now, try and imagine being a senator in the 60s and listening to this guy speak. He was definitely facing a tough crowd, no doubt about it. He understood the fact that a lot of people wouldn't be able to accept his testimony. And in an effort to circumvent these sort of biases, uh, the well-prepared reverend noted the numerous world religions which presently utilized entheogenic sacraments and quoted scripture from Genesis, Numbers, Romans, and Revelations as a sampling of the pertinent biblical material to appeal to the Christians attending his ceremony. He even quoted this one verse from the King James Version from Romans 14. For one believeth that he may eat all things. Another who is weak eateth herbs. Let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. Uh, Reverend Icken had specifically requested that those in attendance not construe his testimony to be some sort of justification for the indiscriminate use of LSD, for he also agreed with other experts that the uh, illicit use of LSD should be curbed by properly educating our nation's youth. However, he made sure to remind his audience that the prohibition of entheogens highlighted what he called a, quote, clear and present violation of the free exercise clause. Now, for those who weren't familiar with the subjective effects of psychedelics, uh, the Reverend had reminded those who were listening that the consumption of these substances is a what he called a parallel of the spiritual experiences classically described by various Western theologians. Uh, and while he would note that the mystical experiences which entheogens reliably afforded took place over the course of a few hours, traditional methods normally required many years of dedication. However, he had remarked that cheap grace is never afforded by our Creator, and that entheogens required, quote, as much discipline as the traditional means of seeking the divine. Waxing poetic at the end of his testimony, he had concluded by reminding Congress that these experiences can serve as a transient dissolution of the various obstacles which have been set in place by the, quote, personal ego of man. Such an experience, he opined, could permit the, quote, grace and light of God to have a free chance to operate in the consciousness of man. The bishop reminded Congress that the objective value of these sacraments relies completely upon the method in which they are used, and respectfully urged Congress to permit the bona fide sacramental ingestion of these substances. Now, even though there was this really great testimony from Reverend Icken, in the years after his testimony, Congress started openly gossiping about this one case about the Neo-American Church. You may have heard of it before. It's just littered all over the congressional record. They love talking about it and the novelty of it. Essentially, this group of hippies had faced some serious drug trafficking charges related to peyote, LSD, and cannabis, if I'm not mistaken. And following a landmark peyote case called People v. Woody, which we'll talk about later, they had essentially tried to use the guise of religious freedom as a post hoc justification to avoid conviction for these serious drug trafficking charges. That was a really interesting case to read. There was a lot of evidence from which to draw for the judge to make the proper decision in that case. The judge in that case, the case was United States v. Cooke, K-U-C-H. Judge Gessel had dutifully noted that the church's faith system was an absurdist mockery of traditional religious systems. For example, the church's symbol, a three-eyed toad, appeared on the group's catechism, which was packed with, quote, with what the judge called, quote, goofy nonsense, contradictions, and irreverent expressions. And the same catechism also firmly asserted that the churchgoers, quote, have the right to practice our religion, even if we are a bunch of filthy drunken bums. The official song of the church, Puff, Puff the Magic Dragon, is seemingly palatable in the face of the official motto of the church, victory over horse shit. Judith Cooke, I still don't know her name, the self-proclaimed primate of the Potomac, had her claim for religious liberty shot down once the judge had remarked that it had become quite clear that the inclination for recreational drug abuse and not sincere religious belief was, quote, the coagulant of this organization and the reason for its existence. After this case, there were a bunch of people in Congress who lambasted the idea that entheogens could serve as actual sacraments. Though there were drug experts saying that indigenous use of these substances did not lead to drug dependence, there were people saying pretty terrible things about peyote and these experiences. For example, one Illinois senator, Robert Cherry, was quoted as saying that those who seek mystical insight through entheogenic substances are not confronted with spiritual revelations, but instead were led into what he called, quote, the world of nothing. Senator Thomas Dodd, in June of '65, warned of, quote, pseudo-intellectuals who advocate the use of drugs in the search of some imaginary freedoms of the mind. It's really remarkable that Reverend Icken was even given a time and place to actually give that testimony, but it's clear that it fell on deaf ears. I should remark, though, that Congress did afford the Native American Church, not the Neo-American, the Native American Church, statutory protection to possess and consume peyote for individual members. And that was specifically codified in 1971, but we can talk about that a little more later.
Right. And so apart from just kind of writing off people's attempts to, justify this as freedom of religion, writing them off as just joke churches, like in the case of the Neo-American Church, what other ways does the government kind of justify imposing upon limits of religious freedom?
Are you saying what conditions need to be necessary for religious freedom to be imposed upon?
That's another way of saying it, yeah.
Okay. Well, to quote every lawyer ever, it depends. religious freedom cases can cover a wide variety of topics. So if we're talking about entheogenic case law, there's no perfect answer for this question, but generally speaking, whenever religious freedom claims are brought before a court, it's not because the parties seeking legal protection are there for some hypothetical burden that they may one day face. It's not like I can go to a court and say, hey, I haven't faced a burden, but I want freedom, religious freedom, give it to me now. No, it doesn't happen. You have to already be burdened for a case to be brought forward. For example, the UDV was raided in 1999. Their shipment of ayahuasca was taken and they were denied the right to consume their sacrament for several years. And that's what led them to bring their case to the federal courts. Now, once a case comes to trial, the process which actually determines whether or not religious freedom claims can be upheld comes down to a process called the Sherbert test. That was inspired by a case in the 60s called Sherbert v. Werner. And that allows courts to weigh not only the burdened party's religious freedom, but it also weighs it against the compelling interests of the government to see which is weightier, which is more important. Now, the first step of this process is for the burdened party to aptly demonstrate that they have a sincere religious conviction, religious belief, which is 2, being substantially burdened. Now, if the burdened parties can meet this burden of proof, the next step would go to the government. It is then for the government to prove the case from here on out. So the second step, the second prong of the Sherbert test, would be where the government would have to prove that their burden, that the burden that they are imposing upon this person is in furtherance of a compelling government interest. Now, generally speaking, compelling government interests in these sorts of cases related to entheogens usually come in the form of protecting the health and safety of the general population as well as those who consume these substances. Now, compelling government interests can and certainly should justify the restriction of certain religious practices which endanger, let's say, the welfare of others. The Supreme Court has defined these exceptions as, quote, only the gravest abuses, endangering paramount interests. Now, hypothetically speaking, it would certainly be justifiable for the government to have a compelling interest in prohibiting religiously inspired violations of all traffic laws or deific decrees of murder, being commanded by God to take the life of another. I've actually read cases concerning the latter. Let's just say religious freedom was not the focus of that case. But if the government can't aptly demonstrate that the application of the burden is in furtherance of their previously mentioned compelling government interest, the case is settled in favor of the burdened party. However, the government's usually able to satisfy this burden. So it then goes on to the third step, where the government must convince the court that the application of the burden is already the least restrictive means of furthering their compelling government interest. Now, the term least restrictive means can be a little confusing, so I'll phrase it a little bit differently. The government must prove that there is absolutely no possible scenario where the religious act in question can be somewhat accommodated in some fashion by the government. Now, if the government cannot meet the burden of proof in demonstrating that the application of the burden is the least restrictive means of furthering their compelling interest, that's a mouthful, then the religious communicants have gained protection for their previously burdened acts. For example, when the UDV's case was heard by the Supreme Court, the justices unanimously agreed about the fact that the government could most certainly accommodate the UDV because of the fact that a much larger church, the Native American Church, already holds a statutory exemption allowing them to possess and ingest peyote unlike the general population. And in this case, it was clear that the DOJ could not make a good faith argument that no exceptions could be made for the UDV and their small congregation, when a substantially similar exception was already in place for millions of Indigenous Americans. Now, if the government can prove that the application of the burden is already the least restrictive means of furthering their compelling interest, then the claims for religious freedom can be shot down, unfortunately. That's how the cookie crumbles sometimes. But don't forget, there's always the appeals process. But, if we're talking about entheogenic sacraments, judges from across the political spectrum are going to have differing opinions on this topic. There's no modern judicial consensus by any means. You'll certainly find a lot of conservative judges who would shoot down these kind of claims, but at the same time, there are a lot of conservative judges, like ones you might find in the Federalist Society, who are so utterly afraid of challenging judicial precedent related to religious freedom that they will rule in favor of such cases. Some liberal judges, which might have a pro-drug stance, might rule in favor of these sorts of cases, while some may say no. It's really a mixed bag, and in the meantime, there is no consensus, to say the least. It's a case-by-case basis.